Please take your seats. We are about to begin in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the session on fundamental freedoms 1, including freedom of expression, free media, and information. Today's session includes address by the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, and which is one of the main activities of the representative mandated by the participating states to report to the Human Dimension Implementation meeting. As yesterday, I remind that the discussion will start after the speaker's presentation. Hopefully there will be time for the representative to sum up the discussions that will follow. The list of participants is already, the list of speakers is already closed. We have 50 participants who want to speak after the introduction of the topic. I again request that audiovisual recording is not taken as it is live streamed. I don't think there are any other points of order I should make before I give floor to the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, Arlem Desir, who was appointed in July 2017 for the period of 3 years. Previously, Mr. Desir was the French Secretary of State for European Affairs, but before joining the French government, he was for 15 years a member of the European Parliament. As most of you know, the representative has a mandate to intervene on all media freedom issues in the 57 OSCE participating states, including on individual cases, safety of journalists, imprisonment, but also on legislation and promotion of media pluralism. With this, I give the floor to Representative Desir.
Thank you, Andre, Chair, Excellencies, dear representative of civil society, of ODIHR, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for all for coming to this session today on freedom of expression, free media, and information. As Andre just mentioned, introducing this session, I would like to give you an overview of the media freedom situation across the OSCE region since our last HDIM 1 year ago, as I can see it on the base of our intervention to the participating states. Of course, I will not detail all of the intervention, but just try to share with you what kind of trends and lessons we can draw from this. And this is just to open the discussion. During the last year, media freedom has been under a high level of strain and pressure in many participating states, if not all, in different sort of problems. The safety of journalists is under constant threat. Journalists faced continued judicial harassment, and the economic environment for journalism and the press is shrinking. Since last year, many journalists have been attacked, beaten, or shot at. 2 have even been killed in our region. Earlier this year in May, it was Laura McKee, a young journalist from the United Kingdom, who was shot while covering riots in Northern Ireland. In June, in Ukraine, journalist Vladimir Komarov, a local journalist in Kharkiv, died in coma after being the victim of a brutal attack. But the issue of violence goes beyond the sole cases of killed journalists, and I fear many more could face the same fate if things continue on the current slope in our region. The attacks against journalists are of many kinds and come from a wide range of different actors in different contexts. More and more actors, be it political groups or powers, violent extremists and terrorists, mafia, soccer supporters, street protesters, they are all different, but all of them, at a point, think that they can stop, intimidate, or punish the press by exercising violence because they don't like what they read, what they hear, and what they see in the media. I am very much concerned by such an evolution, which represents a kind of generalization and banalization of violence against the press. In the OSCE region, we are still far from the numbers in countries such as Mexico regarding the numbers of killed journalists. But what happens there shows us that there is potentially no limit to the extension of the use of violence against the press if we don't oppose it vigorously. If I look at the past year in our region, and without, again, being exhaustive, I could mention several violent physical attacks, including, for example, in Turkey, just before and during summer, with 2 shootings against journalists from different cities, and many were beaten, which left them seriously wounded. I could also mention in June the multiple incidents involving detention and mistreatment of journalists who covered protests in Moscow. I could also remind earlier this year the violence we witnessed against journalists during demonstrations, especially coming from protesters in France. There is many other examples in Italy, in Georgia, in Greece, in Serbia. The authors are different, but it's a fact. There is more and more of this aggressivity and violence against the press. The protection of journalists is a duty of the state, and it is crucial in order to safeguard the role of journalists and media freedom in any circumstances that the perpetrators of such attacks and crimes are identified and face justice. Impunity for the perpetrators of these attacks, the passivity in investigating, or the failing to publicly condemn these aggressions breed further violence. I remind that in the very important ministerial decisions adopted by the 57 participating states in Milan on safety of journalists, there is an insistence on the fact that the political leaders must publicly condemn those attacks and explain why they will not accept such a banalization, being just threats or violence or, of course, killing of journalists. We have also seen the specific gendered harassment of female journalists, especially online, who are attacked both as journalists and as women. This leads to a situation in which the very purpose for which the internet was created is being reversed. While providing the space for different voices, it also provides the possibility for these voices to be targeted and ultimately silenced. These online threats often translate into real-life aggression. Most often, my interventions to the participating states since the last HDIM were on issues related to the safety of journalists. What is at stake here is not just the physical integrity of the journalist, but the right of citizens to be informed, the right to investigate and report on issues of public interest, the possibility to hold those in power accountable, and to give a space for diverse and critical voices. It is the role of the media in democracy that is at stake, and this role is not accepted by many people, which is deeply worrying. In the Milan Ministerial Council decision on safety of journalists, the OSCE participating states also committed themselves to respect and protect the legal safety of journalists, the legal environment in which they can develop their activity. But this legal safety of journalists is still facing many threats. Journalists are prosecuted, imprisoned, and detained based on diverse accusations, including of extremism or terrorism. I call again to seize such false accusations against the press. The fight against terrorism and extremism should unite society, not divide it. Combating terrorism and extremism should never be used by governments to restrict media freedom. We also have noticed many cases of defamation lawsuits against journalists reporting on issues of public interest, especially on corruption cases. Defamation laws often carry excessive sanctions and penalties, which put additional pressure on journalists and can contribute to the silencing of critical voices. It is a clear threat to investigative journalism and to independent media. This year, I also intervened on several cases of media outlets being forcibly closed, of internet websites being blocked, of search and seizures of journalists' properties and material, and of different instances of attempt against the confidentiality of sources. Physical safety, legal safety, but this year, in view of more and more of our intervention, I would also mention the issue of the digital safety of journalists, and more widely, of the digital right for freedom of expression and free media as a new domain of concern. And I'd like to say now a few words on this issue. In a joint declaration that we released in July during the Global Conference on Media Freedom in London, along with the 3 special rapporteurs on media freedom from the United Nations, the Organization of American States, and the African Commission, we paid a particular attention to the new challenges to online freedom and the responsibility of the state and the risk of private control over communications. This is the future of freedom of expression. In this domain, we need more transparency and accountability to protect human rights, particularly when a small number of social media companies have such a wide control over our access to information and to free expression. There is no doubt about the contribution of digital technologies to expanding global communications and the possibility for people everywhere to access information and ideas, to communicate and to be heard. And many of the civil society organizations here are linked to new medias created in the past years, especially and just on this online sphere. So we are not here putting at stake the gain and the opportunity. But this abundance of information and sources and this universal development of the information networks has also created new challenges and new reactions to the new phenomena. Among them, there is the question of how to deal with the digital dissemination of violent extremist content, of terrorist propaganda, and of the enormous quantity of hateful rhetoric. How to tackle the issue of the disinformation, manipulation of information, and viral deception. How to answer and to protect media diversity and sustainability of the media in an economic environment that has financially devastated the media landscape and the resources available for professional journalism. These and other questions linked to online freedom of expression, including surveillance and the use of artificial intelligence, are key for the future. We have also observed many instances of states introducing overbroad restrictions which lead to unequal access to information, new censorship, and the risk of a fragmented internet. And we can see where the model could be took. In some countries outside of the OSCE, where there has been the establishment of a kind of separated internet. In our joint declaration, we made several recommendations to build and maintain a free, open, and secure internet. And this is very important, I think, for the OSCE, especially because we are a region with so diverse country, diverse jurisdiction, but with the same commitment regarding circulation of information, freedom of the press, freedom of the media, and where we should try to deal together with all the aspects of this evolution, of this new digital transformation. I know it will also be an issue discussed at the eve of the future Ministerial Council not specifically on the human dimension aspect, on the economic, for example, and security aspect, but I think we have to introduce this human dimension into this, this digital transformation meetings and discussions that we have. I will insist more specifically on some issues. First, over the coming years, states should recognize the right to access and use the internet as a human right. The access to the internet has become a precondition for the exercise of freedom of expression. Secondly, freedom of expression requires a digital infrastructure that is robust, universal, and accessible to all. States should not disrupt or shut down internet or telecommunication network, and on the contrary, invest in internet and infrastructure which allow all citizens to access to the network. Third, states should also refrain from adopting national legislation that limits access to the global internet, and there is a risk, I mentioned it, of fragmentation of the internet, and we have expressed our concern about the idea, for example, of sovereign internet, that kind of idea. Fourth, states should respect and reinforce the principle of network neutrality. Then, when it comes more precisely to the regulation of online content, I will insist on two principles. The first one is that states should protect freedom of expression in accordance with international human rights law, including in their requirement on internet intermediaries. Article 19 of the ICCPR and Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights and the subsequent jurisprudence provide guidance on limitation to freedom of expression. Today, it has become a problem because technically, because of the scale of the issue, millions of content which has to be checked every day or hour by big internet network, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, nobody looks to the details of this article. There is the automatic system or procedure which are based on community guidelines or those terms of services that you sign without reading it. And on this base, a selection is made between what can be published or not, which was previously made by a judge who take into account an historical jurisprudence made by the European Court of Human Rights. Now it's made into 1 second by an automatic system and perhaps checked by some people working in this company. And that's why the second principle is that social media companies, search platforms, and other internet intermediaries have responsibilities in dealing with problematic content. It's clear, because if you want to fight against racist content, anti-Semitism, neo-Nazi content, you cannot ask to a judge to have the time to look at the million of hateful speech. So it is to the company to do it. They are the only one technically to be able to do it, but they must not become the controllers of our fundamental human rights. So that's the problem. It's normal that we ask them to take more responsibility, but we should not leave to them the ultimate decision of what can or cannot be published. It's something they have a tendency to do now to avoid to have problems, including with the judiciary and the state. So it's legitimate to ask them to do more, but we should not ask them to shape the future of freedom of expression. And ultimately, the independent judiciary system must control and decide on this matter. So there is all the issue of the remedy, the procedure, how you appeal, and so on, and how you control even the procedure used by the company. So that's why we need rules and laws that tackle unlawful content, but preserve clearly freedom of expression, including in the requirement towards social media platform. And this demands an international shared understanding of what we want the company to do. And it's clear that even in the OSCE region, we need it, because not everybody agrees on what is a terrorist content, what is a risk for national security, what is unlawful. Perhaps it's not possible to agree on all. There is different historical context, different approach. In the US, the First Amendment, for example, make it very difficult to justify to stop some content, even if there is recognition that in some matters, for reason of national security or fight against terrorism, you can justify it, while in France, in Germany, you have different tradition regarding the restriction of freedom of expression, where it's more easy, perhaps, to stop some content based on the fight against racism, and some other European countries have a kind of mix of both. I would think of Sweden, for example, which have almost the equivalent of the First Amendment in this constitution, but which is also in this European culture where we agree on the fact that some content could be blocked. So we need, I think, more discussion internationally. It's clear that on some issue, I think most of the states could agree, and this will be helpful, and on those where there is some differences, we could try to narrow it. To avoid, for example, I mentioned the fact that there is too much cases in which journalists are prosecuted because of accusation of complicity of terrorism or terrorist propaganda, which is false. So we could agree on this, that we all agree on the necessity to block terrorist video of Daesh with stabbing of hostages and that kind of thing, but that we cannot consider that a journalist who do a report on the situation of a minority in a country, even if there is some terrorist group in this minority, is responsible for the activity of this terrorist group. That's a different thing. Doesn't mean he's complice of the activity of the violent group. He can express his own view, his own opinions. That's a different thing. We could agree, I suppose, on this and avoid to have two different ways to deal with what we ask to the social media company. Because ultimately, Facebook, they are operating in France, in Germany, in Turkey, in Russia, everywhere. So they will take like the common ground. And the risk is that they take a kind of minimum ground if the pressure in certain of the states and the jurisdiction are very far from freedom of expression. But I think that we should also establish this dialogue, not only among states, but also with civil society actors, private actors, of course, to ensure interoperability and efficiency in the regulation of the Internet. That's why we also need to establish an oversight of the Internet companies that will include this representative of the state, civil society, academia, especially when it comes to the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence in the moderation or blocking of content. And I insist again that we need ultimately the judicial appeal mechanism, which will establish jurisprudence of online content regulation in line with existing guarantees for freedom of expression and other fundamental rights. There have been many ongoing international discussions on this issue for many years, and my office has been at the forefront of these debates. That is why we will launch a new project to explore the impact of artificial intelligence on freedom of expression and freedom of the media, of which you will be able to hear more at our side event later today. Ladies and gentlemen, the OSCE, with its comprehensive approach to security, I think is the right place to address the important challenge of protecting security both in the digital and in the real world without limiting human rights. In order to overcome this challenge, we should all together, civil society organizations, government representatives, and the OSCE, engage in a frank and, I wish, constructive dialogue on the way forward so as to protect the journalist community, the freedom of expression, and to ensure a full respect for the OSCE commitments on media freedom. And so that is the purpose of this session today, this morning, and I'm looking forward to your interventions, testimonies, ideas, and propositions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before we start the debate, I would like to remind several things. First of all, please speak in the capacity in which you registered for the debate. Please talk on the topic of this session. And as you probably know, we have 4 sessions related to freedom of the media. If yesterday the discussion mostly focused about online freedom, today we expect that the discussion will be on the report by the representative on freedom of the media and with on the grievances that the representative shared with you. The speakers list, as I said, is 50. Therefore, everyone will have 2.5 minutes. It's a bit less than yesterday. Please present your interventions in a meaningful, orderly, and respectful manner, observing the time limit and focusing on the recommendation related to the topic of this session. Once again, maybe in vain, but I urge everyone to start with the recommendations so that they will be heard by everyone as the most important part of what you say. With this, I start my list. The first is Sweden on behalf of the European Union, to be followed by Tajikistan.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm honoured to speak on behalf of the European Union, and the following countries align themselves with this statement: North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. And according to your wish, I will start with the recommendations. Fully respect the international obligations and commitments on freedom of expression and media freedom, in particular to create and maintain a safe and enabling environment so that journalists and other media actors may perform their work independently and without undue interference. Secondly, engage constructively with the representative on freedom of the media and make use of his expertise and recommendations. Third, respect the mandate and autonomy of the representative and provide him with the necessary resources to fulfill this mandate. Now, freedom of expression, including freedom of the media, remains a top priority for the European Union, including in the OSCE work. As we have heard, attacks and restrictions that target journalists and other media actors are not only a violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms, but also a threat against our common security. It's crucial that states live up to their international obligations and OSCE commitments, first and foremost to refrain from interference and censorship, and to ensure a favourable environment for inclusive and pluralistic public debate, both offline and in digital contexts. In light of the negative trend for freedom of expression and media freedom in much of the OSCE region, the autonomous role and fearless voice of the representative are directly needed to provide early warning and rapid response when states fail to implement their commitments. We fully support the work of the representative and his able team. The strong and flexible mandate of the representative must be preserved and his budget safeguarded. Over the last year, the EU has repeatedly raised media freedom concerns such as safety of journalists and undue restrictions, often joining the cause of the representative. With staggering numbers of journalists in detention and pre-trial detention, the situation for media freedom in Turkey remains deeply worrying. Many trial and sentences raise serious questions about the state of the rule of law and the respect for human rights, including cases linked to the media outlets Cumhuriyet, Zaman, now closed, and Özgür Gündem, now closed. The EU has also voiced concern about the shrinking democratic space for dissenting voices in Russia, including new restrictive legislation targeting both online and traditional media, as well as causes of pressure on independent media actors. In the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, illegally annexed by Russia, and in the part of eastern Ukraine controlled by Russian-backed army formations, enforced disappearances, harassment, and threats of journalists and persons speaking out against de facto authorities contribute to the culture of fear, silence, and self-censorship. We call for the immediate release of Ukrainian journalist Stanislav Aseyev, reportedly held in non-government-controlled Donetsk. We also recall our concern with regard to the pressure and imprisonment of media actors in Azerbaijan, such as the sentence in March against Anar Mammadov, while the president pardonings in March were a positive step. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tajikistan, to be followed by Russian Federation.
Distinguished moderator, dear participants in the meeting, at the present time, Tajikistan has provided all of the conditions required for appropriate work by journalists, and they make sure that freedom of expression is allowed. We have the legal standards required for this to be the case, and all of these measures are adopted on a cooperative basis and in consultation with international organizations. There are no obstacles to the activities of the media. We have several hundred publishing houses and broadcasters registered. And we believe that freedom of expression is one of the main bases for the development of a democratic society. But unfortunately, fake news is a problem. Sometimes there is fake news being published for the purpose of achieving criminal ends or destabilizing the political situation. Another aspect that needs to be taken into consideration is the fact that a number of periodicals have been disappearing in Tajikistan. There were 2 newspapers last year simply closed down. There has been a development of electronic media, and this has resulted in the readership and subscriptions declining, and that is why these newspapers are closing down. And we believe that this is an obstacle to freedom of expression and diversity of media. But it is certainly not true that there are any obstacles set legally to freedom of speech. And then there are a number of so-called news agencies that are supposedly reporting objectively on the situation, but in fact they are used as information platforms to spread the fake news. And this, certain organizations have been identified as terrorist organizations. These are organizations that are not officially registered, and they are acting on the basis of double standards that are not consistent with the law in the country. Now, the representatives of independent media are protected by a new law that has been adopted. The various activities of journalists are protected thereby. There is also a problem, but it occurs rarely, of lack of access to internet pages. There are situations in which certain internet pages are temporarily closed down, but this occurs rarely, and it is almost always because of technical reasons and the blocking of certain sites for security reasons for certain periods of time is decided by the authorities if the sites are used to disseminate extremist information. And a similar practice, of course, is also the case in a number of European countries, as indicated in the report of Harlem Desir. But all in all, there are very good conditions for the development also of local media in our country, which is very important also for democratization. Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, freedom of expression and freedom of the media in the OSCE region is unsatisfactory. We see the relentless growth of instances of journalist rights being trampled in the OSCE area. These include Russian journalists. Some states have state-backed mechanisms for exerting pressure on media they don't like. We are categorically opposed to these practices. We insist that all participating states must unswervingly uphold the universal principles of freedom of the media as per the commitments they've taken upon themselves. First and foremost, we call on the Ukraine to make public the results of the murder investigations by the law enforcement authorities. I'm referring to the murders in 2014 of Mr. Stenin, Voloshin, Kornilyuk, and Klyan. Kiev is continuing to crack down on the media landscape. They're whipping up anti-Russian hysteria. They're expulsing and arresting Russian journalists. This is all now common currency. The Ukrainian military is also shelling Russian journalists in Donbass. We're going to be focusing on this at one of the other sessions. Also, the Russian media has seen its rights trampled in France. Paris has systematically exerted pressure on Sputnik, RT France, and RIA Novosti. They've been denied accreditation to the Élysée Palace and to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Also, in the United Kingdom, we've seen the Russian media demonized, fueling an atmosphere of hatred and disgust and distrust. And the icing on the cake is the fact that RT and Sputnik, two Russian media outlets, were denied accreditation to an international conference on media freedom, which took place in London on the 10th and 11th of July. In the Baltics as well, there are many restrictions on the Russian media and journalists. We call on participating states to guarantee journalists all of their rights as they're duty-bound to do. We continue to be baffled by the media landscape in Crimea. It's surprising that there's been so much attention paid to the Russian peninsula, given the fact that the media landscape in the Crimea is basically beyond reproach, given what's happening in Ukraine. Here in the room, we have some representatives of the Crimea who are going to tell us about the situation there. And we'd like to underscore that the freedom of the media and the freedom of expression are upheld throughout the Russian Federation, including in Crimea, which is part of the Russian Federation. We call on everyone to visit this Russian region, to speak firsthand to the locals, instead of picking up information about the Crimea from dubious sources. I will be submitting the full version of my statement to the Secretariat. Thank you. I would like to remind everyone that we have 2.5 minutes each.
By Malta.
Добрый день, я Рустам Хайдаров,
My name is Haydarov, and I represent an NGO from Tajikistan. The government of Tajikistan has gone through a difficult period. This has been true for both the governments and the NGO since it was liberated from the Soviet Union. We have had a civil conflict, but thanks to our international partners, the OSCE, the UN, and others, we've managed to achieve peace. And the government has made a tremendous contribution to developing mass media, both government-controlled and independent. And there has been a real contribution made to developing a new form of national journalism. And some of the independent media have managed to contribute greatly to the socioeconomic development of the country. And yet some independent media have been forced to stop their activities. And it has been said that in Tajikistan this was because of political considerations, but that's not true. They simply were not in a position to attract enough readership or viewership, and therefore, for economic reasons, they had to close down. Those that are truly useful for the society are continuing to function. I worked myself as an independent journalist for a long time, and I can tell you that it's difficult for independent media to survive for purely economic reasons. It seems to me that there is more of a problem of combating fake news, making sure that one is credible and reliable, because that is the only way to survive. Now, another problem is the use of languages and Arabization of certain languages used in Tajikistan. If you use the Arabic alphabet, you reach a certain readership, and obviously those educated in the Soviet period are not always able to gain access to this, and this is one of the reasons why readership is lost, and that results in economic difficulties. For those economic media, there is no political pressure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Malta aligns itself with the statement delivered by Sweden on behalf of the European Union, but I wish to avail myself of this opportunity to make some additional remarks in my national capacity to share our experience on the reform of the relevant legislation. The representative of the freedom of the media mentioned in his introduction the importance of having a sound legal framework that provides an appropriate environment in which journalists can carry out their work. The main testament of Malta's resolve to enhance freedom of expression was the 2018 Media and Defamation Law. Through this legislation, which includes 18 principal amendments, Malta has extended fundamental rights to its citizens to higher levels. Among various other aspects, the legislation has outlawed criminal libels and provided more protection for journalists and citizens alike. Through this legislation, previous hindrances, which could also serve as a burden on the individual, were abolished in order to encourage and support the participation and engagement of journalists, citizen journalists, and citizens as part of a wide and fully engaged democratic society. The Media and Defamation Law follows extensive reforms, which had also contributed to the widening of artistic freedom of expression. Together, these two legislations have enabled us to reach new horizons, in enabling our society to thoroughly benefit from more freedom of expression and a stronger democracy. Following these successes and inspired by the notion that these freedoms are beneficial in creating a more healthy democracy, we intend to continue to enhance these freedoms. Throughout this reform process, Malta has greatly benefited from the OSCE representative on the freedom of the media's recommendations and support, which enabled us to reinforce the legislative reform process. On this occasion, we would like to benefit from Mr. Désir's presence to once again express our country's gratitude and to underline our commitment to maintain our cooperation with your office, Mr. Désir, in the pursuit of setting higher standards of freedom of expression, free media, and information in our country and across the OSCE region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. RT to be followed by Romania.
Thank you. It is very sad and disappointing that for the last 2 years we have seen an increasing volume of illegitimate restrictions on RT's freedom to operate within France coming from the French government. We have been denied access to government-run institutions, party political gatherings, public buildings, and a host of other spaces. This prohibiting is then coupled with deliberately misleading statements and changing pretenses, including false statements and outright disinformation about our work, phony accusations of political attacks and fake news, and most recently, connecting completely unrelated matters as grounds for these unprecedented actions. The same government that tries to instruct others on human rights and liberties has systematically attempted to restrict free media and shut out RT, all the while professing to the world to uphold the highest standards of these media freedoms. RT's journalists are routinely prevented from reporting news and denied access to the Élysée Palace, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Justice, various electoral headquarters, such as those of the La République En Marche, not to mention state buildings such as prisons. Meanwhile, in Russia, French media are granted open access by the Russian government, and they're able to freely report from our Duma and from the Kremlin, free from the limits that our journalists face in France. In a recent statement by the French foreign minister on a trip to Russia, he alluded to France's full commitment to freedom of expression, yet shifted his government's long-standing false pretenses for restricting RT to a claim implicating France's independent media regulator, the CSA, ignoring the fact that local French outlets are known to have worse records than RT and that the restrictions imposed by the French government predated any matter between RT and the CSA. Also, the CSA issues no guidance to suggest the imposition of such restrictions on RT. The French foreign minister labeled his nation's participations in this very forum as evidence of France's commitment to upholding media freedoms. Therefore, I call on this body to oppose the discriminations against RT and other media in France, and to ask the French foreign minister to live up to this forum's expectations for media freedoms in hope of ensuring uninhibited media access for all within his country, as the international community has come to expect. Thank you.
Thank you. Romania to be followed by Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation.
La Roumanie salue chaleureusement la présence.
Romania would like to welcome the statement made by Mr. Halim Désir, the representative for the freedom of the media. We commend all efforts aimed at upholding the safety of journalists and media freedom.
European Union, but we would like to make just a few remarks in our national capacity. You refer, Mr. Representative, to threats to freedom of expression and freedom of the media, and in this regard, I would focus my intervention on the negative impact of deliberate creation and dissemination of false or manipulated information intended to deceive and mislead audiences. Irrespective of the source and modality, offline or online, disinformation inevitably and always weaken the security of our countries, cripple a cohesive society, and undermine the trust in institutions and in media, and ultimately in our democracies. In this context, more than ever before, promoting free media and quality journalism and unhindered access to quality information are of paramount importance for our democratic values. I must add that the topic of investing in resilience to overcome vulnerabilities such as disinformation and fake news, including in electoral context, was a priority of the Romanian presidency of the Council of the European Union during the first semester of this year. And this is a standing priority also illustrated by the planning of a side event together with the delegation of Finland to the OSCE on this topic. I take the opportunity to invite you all to remain in this very same room after this morning's session, hoping that you will enjoy to take part in a more open and practical exchange of views on the most effective methods and strategies for tackling threats. Mr. Desir is featuring as a keynote speaker. Let me end by saying that we have a solid acquis of commitments in the field of freedom of expression. We should reflect on ways to tackle these threats to freedom of expression and freedom of the media and enhance resilience and counter hybrid threats. In this regard, I would like to submit the following recommendations for participating states. Raise awareness about the phenomena of disinformation, strengthen social resilience, citizens' civic trust, and media literacy, and identify the structural weakness in social, political, economic, and security systems that make states vulnerable to disinformation, manipulation, and interference. Cooperation with the civil and academic society in order to ensure an early detection and analysis of practices of disinformation is essential. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation, to be followed by the USA.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Alexander Malkevich. I'm the chairman of the Commission of the Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation. The freedom of expression, freedom of the media, and journalist safety are the major challenges of our time. It is not only wars and natural disasters which currently threaten journalists, but journalists, real journalists, are being subjected to repression, to crackdowns, as they report. And today, as we sit here in this room, we've just received information about the fact that the security services of the Republic of Moldova have detained the head of Sputnik Moldova, our colleague. So, while we sit here, they are running roughshod over the freedom of expression, detaining journalists. And in fact, there's been a lot of interesting information coming out of the Republic of Moldova. In 2019 alone, we've seen a whole host of incidents where Russian journalists have been expulsed from Moldova. And on one occasion, they were actually on their way to interview the president of the Republic of Moldova, and the security forces picked them up at the border. In May, I myself was deported from Chisinau simply because I am a journalist, I'm a public figure. Mr. Harlem Desir is in the room, and he knows the head of the Russian press union, Mr. Solovyov. Last year, the Ukrainian security services prohibited him from entering Ukraine for a period of 3 years. Last year, in Kiev, there was an OSCE conference on the freedom of the media. A Russian journalist and a public figure, Mr. Evgeny Primakov, was on his way to that conference. He was detained. He was turned right around at the airport, and he was banned from entering Ukraine for 5 years. Why are Ukrainians so afraid? Why are the Ukrainian authorities so afraid of Russian journalists, the Russian media? If there are any such people in the room, I'd be delighted to come to Kiev and take part in a conference on the topic, if, of course, they can drum up the courage to host us. Now, our colleague, Mr. Kirill Vyshinsky, was already mentioned. 470 days is how long he spent in prison because he was simply doing his job. 820 days, Mr. Vasilis. 820 days he spent behind bars, although he wasn't actually convicted. They were trying to charge him with terrorism. They didn't manage to prove anything. This is what they do in countries where they fear journalists. That's why they prosecute them. I think we need to move from talk to deeds. Participating states which trample over journalists' rights in such fashion, well, we shouldn't even talk to them. We shouldn't shake their hands. We need to protect all journalists, regardless of the country where they are working, regardless of their opinions. As we protect the freedom of the press, we're protecting our rights to know the truth. I will submit this statement to the Secretariat. Thank you very much. Let me remind you once again to please stick to the 2.5-minute time limit.
America, to be followed by NGO Homa.
Across the OSCE region, authorities restrict the rights of individuals to express themselves freely without fear of recrimination or censorship. In Russia, an unprecedented crackdown on freedom of expression is underway. Authorities use unduly restrictive laws such as overly broad anti-extremism and anti-terrorism statutes. Other laws prohibit offending religious believers, calling for unauthorized protest, and expressing separatist views. New laws passed this year ban disrespect for the state and fake news online. A new law providing for a sovereign internet creates the potential for even greater state control. In Turkey, authorities use broad national security and counterterrorism laws, including laws against insulting the president, to suppress the freedom of expression. The United States joins the Council of Europe in urging Turkey to comply with the European Court of Human Rights ruling, finding the conviction for terrorism of former co-chair of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party and presidential candidate Selahattin Demirtas violated his right to freedom of expression. Prosecutors are seeking life sentences against 16 civil society, media, and business leaders allegedly involved in the 2013 Gezi protests, including philanthropist Osman Kavala, for exercising their right to freedom of expression. More than a dozen reporters for Cumhuriyet newspaper have been convicted of terrorism for their work as journalists. In Azerbaijan, authorities employed charges including drug possession, incitement of religious hatred, terrorism, and attempted coup d'etat to restrict the freedom of expression of religious figures and journalists. Incarceration of youth activist Fuad Ahmadli, religious activist Sadid Dadashvili, and journalist Afgan Mukhtarli raises concerns about the abuse of the judicial system to punish dissent. Although President Aliyev in March released over 50 people widely considered to be political prisoners, a great number remain behind bars. In Kazakhstan, authorities use vaguely defined laws to target dissenting voices. The laws led to criminal charges and a plea agreement for Sertikan Bilash, whose organization Atayurt advocates on behalf of ethnic Kazakhs in Xinjiang. Disinformation endangers the health of democracies. Russia has engaged in a multi-layered assault on the democratic processes and institutions of many participating states, particularly Ukraine, the Baltic states, and the United States. We are committed to working within the OSCE and bilaterally with partners in governments and civil society to build resilience against disinformation and other forms of malign foreign influence. Thank you.
Thank you. Homa, to be followed by Krymskaya Gazeta.
Ladies and gentlemen, I represent an NGO called Homa, who in our activity aims to develop journalism. In Tajikistan, we work with a number of universities that train journalists to work at the level of international standards. They study the legal basis of journalism and ethics, thanks to our efforts. In Article 13 of the Constitution of Tajikistan, we have measures that are very much in line with Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now, in the opinion of international experts, when it comes to access to information, Tajikistan is a leader in Central Asia. The pluralism of the media in Tajikistan is quite impressive. There are a number of NGOs such as ours that work on developing tolerance, combating discrimination, and making sure that journalists act in an ethical manner. We implement and develop various projects to connect our journalists with others abroad, to interact and to cooperate. In Dushanbe, we have organized a conference of journalists on these issues. Journalists are responsible for the information, they're accountable for the information they provide to their readers and their viewers. The editorial policies, of course, can be expressed, but any facts communicated must be checked and fully objective. That is crucial. Thank you for your attention.
Krymskaya Gazeta, to be followed by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Maria Balkonskaya. I'm head of Krymskaya Gazeta.
Mr. Moderator, the delegation of Ukraine would like to raise a point of order on general conduct of the meeting. We address it to you, the Slovak OSCE chairmanship at ODIHR. The OSCE documents establish agreed norms and principles and contain commitments to abide by them. In particular, the Helsinki 1992 document, which has a prominent and direct relevance for the human dimension, reaffirms the validity of the guiding principles and common values of the Helsinki Final Act and the Charter of Paris, defining them as, I quote, the collective consciousness of our community, end of quote. It is with these principles and values in mind that we expect the conduct of human dimension events to be in full compliance with the OSCE acquis. Now we witness an attempt of violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and a repeated provocative attempt to use the HDM for legitimization of the illegal occupation of Ukraine's Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by Russia. The floor was requested by the representative of the entity that was established, controlled, and financed by the occupation authorities in Crimea. Application of legislation of the occupying power, as well as the usage of the by occupying power of the local population for promoting of the change of status, is contravenes international humanitarian law. We expect the OSCE adhere to continue, and the Slovak chairmanship also, to be strictly guided by respective OSCE decisions that recognizes the legal status of Autonomous Republic of Crimea as integral part of Ukraine, as reflected in Journal number 3 of 27th meeting of Committee of Senior Officials in Prague, 1994. Giving the floor to the speaker with these provocative statements, Mr. Moderator, would be against the OSCE principles and commitments, the said OSCE consensus decision, as well as the provisions of the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 68262, territorial integrity of Ukraine. I thank you.
Point of order.
Please.
Yes, colleagues, we went over all of this yesterday. Why go over it again? What we're asking is for a representative of a Crimean media outlet to be able to take the floor. They registered, meeting all of the requirements. Now, it's wonderful that our Ukrainian colleagues have come up with additional arguments over the last 24 hours, but we call on them not to use the OSCE, not to use this meeting to attack the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. We call on you to give the floor to this representative of a Crimean media outlet. This is a meeting about the freedom of expression, so let's not stifle journalists.
I announce a technical break.
So we're not going to discuss the issue?
Please take your seats. We resume the session. I'm sorry to have announced the technical break. I think my explanation is that it becomes a pattern, and therefore we need some discussion with Adir and chairmanship on the issue. We continue with the discussion, and we continue with the speaker, with the same speaker. But the point that we would like to make is that, just let me finish my sentence, please. I have, but let me finish my sentence, may I? The point that we want to make is that we request not to make political statements related to jurisdiction or belonging of certain territory to a given country. Point of order, Canada, please.
Thank you very much, Mr.
You're welcome.
Moderator. I would like to suggest that, given the fact that we have a discussion happening outside the room, that we skip this particular intervention and move on with the rest of the speakers list, which is within your power to do, and that we come back to it once we have a result of the discussions outside of the room. Thank you.
Thank you. I announce another technical break. Thank you very much. I apologize again for the second technical break. I would like to state that Adir and the chairmanship fully adhere to the consensus-based decisions by the OSCE participating states to guarantee freedom of expression. Therefore, please continue.
Thank you very much.
I just want to return to decision 476, which is a consensus decision, which stipulates that you, as moderator, have the right to put anybody in any order on the speakers list as you wish. This is not a denial of free expression. This is simply a restructuring in order to give us time to consider the issue at hand. And I would suggest that we follow the practices as are decided in the rules as described in decision 476, in order that we don't have an issue like that can be avoided, deter us from continuing in this forum
In other
with
words,
everyone present.
if I understand you correctly, in other words, you would like to start the discussion on the issue now.
No, I would simply suggest that you exercise your right that you have been conferred by the participating states of the OSCE to put this particular intervener later in the list in order that we continue with the discussion and we can deal with it later.
But deal in what way?
Well, I think we have some other conversations that need to be had in this room amongst another bunch of people who do have a concern about this particular intervener.
Would you like to start these discussions now again?
No, I don't think it's worth the time of the room, seeing as everyone else has a place on the list and they need to speak as well.
I take your point of order.
Thank you.
Point of order. Я прошу прощения.
I do apologize. However, we have rules of procedure. We have a list, a speaker's list, and depriving a representative the right to speak at a meeting dedicated to the freedom of expression because what she's going to say is at odds with the point of view of a number of states. No comment on that. I call on you to give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Crimea.
Any other point of order? Yes, please.
I'm just going to read to you the relevant paragraph of PC Decision 476, which regards the Speaker's order. And it says here clearly, I have my glasses, this is way too small. When appropriate, moderators may call on speakers out of order to facilitate a genuine discussion. I would remit to the group that we are now not in a genuine discussion and that having this speaker at this point is disruptive to this meeting. And just as had been the case last year when Canada was given the floor 10 or 15 speakers earlier than we had actually been put on the list for a reason that was decided by the moderator, I don't see why that wouldn't apply in the situation this morning. Thank you.
Point of order taken. Krymskaya Pravda. Krymskaya Gazeta, please continue.
The Crimean newspaper, you may continue. Thank you very much. I would like to draw your attention to the declarations that have been made by some of the rapporteurs present at this event. I mean, they're supposed advocates of some residents of Crimea, and they earn their fees by supposedly protecting certain individuals. I mean, we're talking about peoples who are terrorists. There is no question of religious beliefs. If someone is a terrorist, they should be convicted, and their national belonging or ethnic background has nothing to do with that fact. Now, this alleged persecution of Crimean journalists because of their professional background. As an example, these people in the Crimean SOSA are simply members of a terrorist organization, and their criminal prosecution has nothing to do with journalist activity. When it comes to Semenov, we're talking about an individual who had a 2-year deprivation of liberty suspended sentence on very objective judicial grounds. And colleagues from the Ukraine are claiming that this is persecution of an individual because of their beliefs. And now, Timonov was deprived of liberty for 9 years in Ukraine, and 34 journalists and bloggers were also the German journalist Siakov was prevented from entering the country. There are many examples, and they all show that in Ukraine there is not respect for freedom of expression and freedom of the media. And to attack people on some basis without having been to Crimea is simply an attack. And many of those who are fighting for freedom in Ukraine fully understand this, and I will provide the Secretariat with my full text.
Tatar Television and Radio Broadcasting Company Millet.
I'm Joanna Levison, here on behalf of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. We work in 22 languages in 26 countries where press freedom is suppressed by the government or not fully established. This year, we relaunched in Bulgaria and Romania, two countries that are member states not only of the OSCE, but of NATO and the EU. I'd like to mention 5 other areas of particular concern. In Tajikistan, the government has seized on accreditation as a tool to silence our journalists. Currently, 9 RFERL staff members have repeatedly applied for and are awaiting government accreditation. One of our correspondents has been waiting since 2017. The government cannot fulfill its commitments to press freedom if it prevents journalists from doing their jobs. In Kazakhstan, our journalists were repeatedly and arbitrarily detained this year while reporting on public protests. In addition, people in plain clothes have accosted our correspondents and broken their cameras, all while the police look on. In Kazakhstan and Russia, lawmakers and law enforcement have willfully conflated journalism with activism, accusing the foreign press in particular with meddling in politics when it is the job of the media to report on local events. In Crimea, our colleague Mykola Semena remains confined to the peninsula and banned from journalism after being convicted by Russian authorities of separatism for publishing an article protesting Russia's annexation of Crimea. Our contributors Stanislav Vaseyev and Oleg Halazyuk continue to be held incommunicado since summer 2017 by Russia-backed separatists in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region. In Azerbaijan, RFERL's bureau remains closed after the government raided it in 2014 on bogus accusations it has failed to prove in court. Our website has been suspended since 2017 on grounds that we pose a threat to national security. Khadija Ismailova is under a travel ban because of her investigations into high-level corruption linked to members of President Aliyev's family.
Please conclude.
These are attacks on the independent press, they are attacks on fundamental OSCE principles, and they are threats against the safety and security of RFERL colleagues. We condemn them. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Due to technical breaks, I have to limit the time of each speaker to 2 minutes. I'm sorry about it. Now the turn is of Crimean Tatar Television Radio Broadcasting Millet to be followed by International Public Fund Russian Peace Foundation.
I'm sorry. Salam alaikum, доброго дня, здравствуйте.
Good morning. In the spring of 2014, the Crimean Tatars saw long-awaited changes occur. In April, the Constitution of the Republic of Crimea was adopted, and the Crimean Tatar language is now a state language alongside Russian and Ukrainian. That's the first thing. Second, a presidential decree was signed by Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, ensuring the rehabilitation of the Crimean Tatar people, the German peoples, the Greek peoples, and other peoples living on the peninsula. This helped the development of the mass media in Crimea. First of all, we established a Crimean Tatar broadcasting company, which incorporates a radio channel and a radio station and a TV channel. We disseminate information about cultural, economic, and political changes afoot on the peninsula. We work tirelessly to maintain and promote the Tatar language and Tatar culture. This has allowed us to grow audience numbers. Our content, in contrast to that of our Ukrainian colleagues, does not treat with disdain other states, nor does it whip up religious and ethnic tensions. We safe to say, can compare between Russia and Ukraine. For instance, when we had local elections, over 200 Crimean Tatars were elected, representing our peoples in all branches of government. We call on the OSCE to draw attention to the following issues. Number one, all OSCE participating states should recognize human rights, which every person born is to enjoy. The water blockade, the transport blockade, the energy blockade imposed by Ukraine on Crimea. Here are some photographs attesting to that. Why did they do that? Could you please wrap up and speak to the topic at hand? The water blockade I referred to. How does that tie in with international law? Second of all, more and more Ukrainian tourists are coming to. I do apologize. The topic at hand is the freedom of expression. Thank you very much for your statement. That's it. Thank you very much.
Union to be followed by Ukraine.
That's the point.
Our Russian Peace Foundation to be followed by Reformist Youth Public Union.
Российский фонд.
The Russian Peace Foundation. My name is Savutsky. Today in Russia, radio has won over television. On television, there is official propaganda and entertainment programs, whereas radio stations, radio broadcasts provide real facts and news. And radios are listened to all the time. People do their chores and they listen to the radio. As Radio Svoboda works in a way that doesn't need to be blocked. In the USSR, freedom was blocked, and now Russia and the West have almost sort of exchanged places. In the Moscow Duma, a woman has been elected who is against the annexation of Crimea and gay pride parades. But gentlemen, let us stop demonizing Russia. Russians are beginning to understand that democracy is being destroyed in the West. Deng Xiaoping, in his time, quite wisely said that you need to develop, and this is what is happening now in the Russian Federation. Thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am the chairman of the Azerbaijani Association of Young Reformists. Today, discussing the freedom of expression and the freedom of the press, well, I must say that these are prerequisites for democracy to flourish in any country. In Azerbaijan, the freedom of expression and the freedom of the press, including issues such as creating conditions conducive to journalists doing their job, they're very salient issues. We are doing our utmost to ensure that we uphold press freedom and freedom of expression, including online. Currently, the number of official media outlets in Azerbaijan stands at over 5,000, which puts us amongst the top few countries in the CIS and in Eastern Europe. We have no restrictions on transnational media outlets broadcasting in Azerbaijan. Furthermore, our citizens enjoy unimpeded access to social networks. Of late, the number of social network users has grown to over 3 million. This attests to the fact that we're keeping ourselves up to date with what's going on. After all, our population is 10 million people. I also want to state that not a single journalist was arrested for criticizing the government. They've only been arrested when there are specific charges which have been leveled against them, specific accusations. And in fact, the president of Azerbaijan has said that on the basis of the principles of humanism, some journalists will be released, pardoned and released. Therefore, we believe that the accusations leveled at Azerbaijan are groundless. We call on you to adopt a fair approach when dealing with my country. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please don't speak so quickly, just to give our interpreters the chance to be able to interpret you. Ukraine followed by Council of Europe.
Okay, Ukraine will speak later. Council of Europe to be followed by Albania.
Mr. Chair, let me address the issue of a relation between information and democracy. Information is changing, the volume, the content, the platforms. Each of these has evolved beyond recognition in a short period of time. This evolution continues. The questions we must address in 2019 are to what extent the information is reliable, whether this helps or hinders citizens in taking part in democratic processes, and what lessons we should learn from ensuring the free flow of information in the future. To what extent are our opinions and choices, including how we vote, really being shaped for us by the manipulation of facts? A growing number of citizens, aware of being exposed to disinformation, fake news and propaganda, are worried about the authenticity of information in the digital age. The new environment represents also a challenge to the traditional media. How do they still defend the values that represent their profession: independence, the protection of sources, and the prioritization of investigative and field reporting? If technology spreads disinformation, it should be tamed. The new media and tech giants should be held to account based on the need for transparency, responsibility, and neutrality. Council of Europe decided to dedicate this year's edition of World Forum for Democracy to finding answers to the question, is democracy in danger in information age? By bringing together a diverse range of people and experiences, the World Forum can shed light on these challenges and encourage democracy innovations. We hope that the forum, which will take place in Strasbourg from 6 to 8 November, contributes to the evolution of democracy and helps us address the challenges of information age. Thank you.
Thank you. Albania to be followed by Canada.
Thank you, Chair. Freedom of expression and freedom of media remain a priority for the Albanian government. In relation to this, Albania appreciates the close and constructive cooperation with the RFIM office during recent years. The work of the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, Mr. Harlem Desir, and his able team has been crucial in helping, supporting, and advising Albanian institutions in improving legal basis, implementing our shared commitments, and in promoting an open and free media in Albania. But promoting free media and media freedom is fundamental for all our countries, especially at times when harassment, intimidation, and violence against journalists are becoming a great concern throughout the OSCE region and beyond. It is imperative that together we undertake legitimate steps in addressing these challenges. In this regard, we see the role of the RFOM as irreplaceable in tackling these concerns and problems and in assisting countries to commit to democratic principles. Albania will continue to preserve, protect, and support media freedom as a prerequisite of the fulfillment of a wide range of fundamental rights and freedoms. In doing so, we fully support the mandate of the RFIM office in observing media developments and events in the OSCE area. At the same time, we're conscious that policies in promoting quality journalism and positive steps taken to implement them should in no case undermine media freedom and editorial autonomy. The growing developments of new media, technologies, internet use, and the digital transformation offer new opportunities for freedom of expression, media diversification, thus contributing to the promotion of good governance, transparency, and accountability. Enhanced professionalism, better journalism, and fact-checking efforts, transparency and higher accountability within media companies and digital intermediaries can contribute to re-establish trust and healthy relationship between media actors and audiences. In concluding, we are of the view that ensuring the quality of journalism and the safety of journalists is fundamental in securing a more favorable environment for freedom of expression. As we prepare for the next year Albanian OSCE chairmanship, we will continue the efforts by previous chairmanships in implementing our commitments in the freedom of the media. And I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Canada to be followed by Switzerland.
Representative Desir, thank you for your address this morning. We very much share your concerns about increasing threats to media freedom, including the safety of journalists. Given that tomorrow's session will focus on the safety of journalists, I will use this intervention to comment on the other critical aspects of media freedom. As you've pointed out, media freedom consists of defending and advancing truth, but unfortunately this essential role is challenged and subverted in many participating states in myriad ways, and we are particularly concerned about declining media freedom in Turkey and the Russian Federation. Independent media organizations are being put under government control in many states, ensuring control of the message and removing criticism, and in some cases are simply tools of state propaganda. Some states are also increasingly attempting to censor free media online, limiting citizen access to independent media sources. Journalists are harassed and intimidated to deter or prevent their work. Malicious online actors attempt to silence journalists, especially female journalists, through a number of antagonistic measures, not only in their own countries, but also those abroad. All these actions intend to make media less free and to prevent citizens' access to information. Given these developments, Canada joined the United Kingdom to co-host the inaugural Global Conference for Media Freedom in July to take a meaningful step forward in mobilizing the efforts of civil society and governments to collectively address the challenges to media freedom. And Canada looks forward to hosting the second ministerial conference next year in Toronto. In our view, it is critical that we build on the inaugural conference by identifying practical action that states can take to strengthen media freedom, and to follow through by implementing or assisting to implement those actions. In this regard, we believe the representative on freedom of the media has an important role to play in supporting such efforts to improve the media climate in these countries. Mr. Desir does not have an easy role, as was made clear by his address this morning, but it is an essential and unique role that requires an unflagging commitment to identifying threats to freedom of the media and publicly calling on participating states to respect their OSCE commitments. Participating states need to work with the RFM and redouble support for the work of this unique autonomous institution of the OSCE. The defense of media freedom must be a collective effort. Canada proposes the following two recommendations in conclusion: that the RFM and OSCE participating states redouble efforts to address new challenges to media freedom stemming from the evolving online media environment and ensure good internet governance that finds the balance between security, dignity, and the free exchange of information. And secondly, that the RFM examine ways to support participating states' resilience in combating the effects of disinformation and hostile disinformation campaigns, and to explore ways that disinformation can be effectively neutralized by the OSCE and participating states. Thank you.
Switzerland to be followed by Freedom House.
Mr. Moderator, Swiss would like to thank the representative on freedom of the media of the OSCE, Mr. Harlem Desir, for his exemplary work, and we reiterate our full support for these essential efforts. Mr. Representative, in your last report, you concentrate on two key issues. To begin with, you take up the safety of journalists as a theme, and you alert us to the fact that attacks on journalists and indifference concerning that have become standard. And then you deal with the challenges related to practicing freedom of expression online, including surveillance and artificial intelligence. Now, Switzerland welcomes your priorities, which reflect the worrying trends underway in the OSCE region. There's harassment, intimidation, and numerous attacks against journalists online and offline. All of that is unacceptable, and Switzerland condemns this firmly. We call on all member states of the OSCE to bring these attacks to an end and to combat impunity for crimes committed against journalists. Switzerland will continue actively to be involved in this area. We welcome in particular the project of the OSCE, which we support, on the impact of artificial intelligence on freedom of expression. This project aims in particular to promote better understanding of this relationship. Switzerland also reminds us all of the fundamental role to be played by media on the issue of national minorities within diverse communities. Media offer all groups in society an opportunity to shape their own identities and to explore different perspectives. This, of course, implies certain responsibilities, and in this respect, Switzerland welcomes the involvement of your office, Mr. Representative, in the launching of the Tallinn Guidelines on National Minorities in Media in the Digital Age. Thank you.
Merci. Freedom House to be followed by Citizens Labor Rights Protection League.
With the June assumption of power of a new government in Moldova, there is renewed interest in addressing key legislative challenges to media freedom that have long stood in the way of its democratic development. The government has expressed a commitment to improving the legislative environment to ensure media freedom in the country. Freedom House commends the new government's desire to make progress in this important area, as well as their openness to continue engagement with civil society in this process. This is underscored by the Moldovan government's kind support and agreement to co-host a diplomatic briefing in cooperation with Freedom House, Internews, and Moldovan civil society on the sidelines of HDIM. Until 2017, efforts by civil society organizations to encourage improvements in media legislation and policy were not taken into account by Parliament or government. Beginning that year, Parliament formed a working group in cooperation with international actors and Moldovan civil society with the goal of improving the legal and regulatory environment for media. A number of key laws, including the Audiovisual Code, were adopted in 2018 and have since come into force. There are 3 laws remaining, including the Law on Freedom of Expression, the Law on Advertising, and the Law on Access to Information, that need to be updated with input from civil society and the international community in order to address some of the remaining challenges facing media freedom in Moldova. Freedom House calls on OSCE participating states and the representative of Freedom of the Media, RFOM, to continue to offer assistance in encouraging Moldova's media reform efforts, including review of legislative, regulatory, and procedural frameworks to uphold media freedom. Freedom House calls on the Moldovan government to reinitiate the efforts of the Parliamentary Working Group on Media Legislation, in consultation with RFOM, develop and implement approaches to improve media pluralism, and ensure that journalists can do their work in offering the public objective information and the right to truth without intimidation or harassment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Citizens' Labor Rights Protection League, to be followed by Bewegung Gleiche Möglichkeiten für Allen.
Спасибо.
Thank you. I'd like to request Mr. Alem Desir and the representatives of the USA and the EU. Who do you think is not a journalist? Could you give us the list? Because there are people calling for religious confrontation, disseminating calls to arms, constitutional overthrow, the imposition of Sharia law. These people turn out to be journalists, according to your definition. Thus, it appears that all of these people merit the protection of the OSCE, including its representative for the freedom of the media. In Azerbaijan, we have many religious leaders of all sorts who have a press pass in their pocket. And Freedom House, Article 18, and similar organizations, including the OSCE, the Council of Europe, and the EU, offer them protection. Representatives of international organizations are straying beyond their mandate in offering protection to these people. Now, someone mentioned the blocking of internet resources. But what are we to do when thousands of videos are disseminated across social networks? There are often live streams, comments being disseminated, which sow the seeds of confusion amongst the public at large. They incite people to commit unlawful acts. They spread hatred and intolerance. And this is what you here at a pan-European organization call the freedom of expression. How can Europe uphold its values if it also allows for these provocations to occur? You yourselves are trampling the very values which you purportedly uphold. 10 to 15 years ago, thank you very much.
Furalen, to be followed by Amnesty International.
Я не совершал это. Я не был.
Well, I was not the individual who was supposedly had a Kalashnikov. Kadyrov Masharipova, a citizen of Uzbekistan, said those words. He is too being charged with committing a terrorist act on 1 January 2018. Now, the mass media for some 3 to 4 days after this occurred announced to the whole world that this terrorist act was carried out by that individual. Now, through the Uzbekistan secret services, everyone heard that this individual committed this terrorist act, which simply was not true. Now, more than 500 people in confrontation or in conflict with the authorities have been extradited into Uzbekistan. John Asbarov, who was a witness, has been deprived of his citizenship. So the authoritarian regime uses the instruments of democracy to achieve their own ends. And when we try to defend our rights, we are attacked through the media. And this instrument in the hands of an authoritarian regime, when the mass media is not free and independent, but no, we would appeal to the authorities of all countries, including the United States and Great Britain with their supposed independent media. No, there is cooperation of those radio stations, BBC and others, with the secret services.
Amnesty International's statement concerns Turkey with recommendations to the government of Turkey to allow civil society organisations and media outlets that have been arbitrarily closed to reopen and restore their confiscated property. Ensure that any closures or other restrictions on media outlets comply with Turkey's obligations to respect the right to freedom of expression and be open to appeal before an independent and impartial court. Ensure that people can gather and protest peacefully, including by lifting the repeated bans imposed on LGBTI events, the Saturday Mothers, and other peaceful demonstrations across the country. Repeal Articles 301, denigrating the Turkish nation, 318, alienating the public from military service, 215, praising a crime or a criminal, and 125, criminal defamation of the Penal Code. Drop all charges and release journalists and media workers who have been detained solely for peacefully carrying out their media work, and cease detaining and prosecuting journalists and media workers and others for peacefully expressing their views. Repeal or amend Article 6/2, printing or publishing declarations, statements of a terrorist organisation, and Article 7/2, making propaganda for a terrorist organisation of the anti-terrorism law, to ensure that they are precisely and clearly formulated and can no longer be used to prosecute people merely for the peaceful expression of their views. Repeal paragraphs 2 and 3 of Article 216 of the Penal Code, incitement to hatred or hostility, to ensure that they can no longer be used to prosecute people merely for the peaceful expression of their views. And we submit a longer statement to the meeting.
Thank you very much. Crimean Human Rights Group, to be followed by Eurasian Dialogue Foundation.
Добрый день.
Good day. To begin with, we've been asked to start with recommendations, so we'll start with that. We would call upon participating states in the OSCE to insist that the Russian Federation stop the jamming of independent Ukrainian media in Crimea. For 5 years now and more, we have been monitoring the human rights situation and the freedom of expression situation in Crimea. And back in 2014 already, the digital and other broadcasting means of Ukrainian radio and television stations were completely destroyed. The equipment was taken over by the Russian military, and there has been an attempt to broadcast at least into North Crimea, and so radio towers have been built along the border. However, whenever you cross the border of Crimea, the frequencies in question are completely blocked and jammed and taken over by Russian radio and television stations. So those entities that have received official access to those frequencies cannot, in fact, broadcast. And at least 6 Ukrainian radio stations are not accessible in the densely populated areas of Crimea. In Jankoy, Armyansk, and Krasnorekopsk, this situation pertains. According to our monitoring, and we have noted that there is hate speech being broadcast by the Russian-controlled radio and television stations in Crimea. At least 4 internet pages that were accessed a lot by Crimean have been blocked on the territory of Crimea. Now, there is an obligation, according to the 1975 Helsinki document, to allow for free broadcasting across borders and to make it possible for radio broadcasts to be received freely in accordance with the principles of 1989 of the ITU. So there are a number of other obligations, and we call on the Russian Federation to follow them in Crimea.
For human rights.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Harlem Desir, Reporter Without Borders in its statement state President Emmanuel Rahman, who is officially titular founder of the peace and national unity and leader of the nation, increasingly acknowledges his authoritarian tendencies, sorely threatening the fragile national consensus built after a civil war. Government pressure compounded by an economic crisis has resulted in this closure of most independent media outlets, a great deal of self-censorship, and the departure of dozens of journalists into self-imposed exile, continued this statement. Unfortunately, harassment by the intelligence service, intimidation, and blackmail are now part of the daily routine of the journalists who stayed behind. Also, after 2015 crackdown, we lost freedom of speech in Tajikistan. Belong to the Reporter Without Borders analysis. In 2014, Tajikistan was in 115th position for freedom of speech and mass media. Until 2018, we lost more 34 position, and now Tajikistan, from 180 countries list from freedom of speech, is on 149 place and was concluded to red zone countries for freedom of speech. Since 2014, around 10 independent mass media in Tajikistan were closed and around 50 journalists fled the country. My recommendation to urge the OSCE and friendly countries and also international community is, I'm calling you as a journalist from Tajikistan to call Tajik government and especially intelligence service stop to using our family member, I mean the journalist family member, to morally, because in Tajikistan probably the family members are morally terrorizing, and by this way Tajik government asking to go us back. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Turkmenistan Helsinki Foundation, to be followed by Uspішна Варта.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Darmajik Bugena, the Turkmen Helsinki Fund. If I may, I'd like to address the official Turkmenistan delegation and representatives of the OSCE. What do you suggest we do to resolve the situation surrounding Ms. Sultan Alcheva, an activist and a journalist? Over the summer, she was once again banned from leaving Turkmenistan. My sister was banned from exiting the country, so the travel ban imposed by Mr. Niyazov actually applies to all members of my family and my husband as well. That's the first thing. Second of all, a UN has adopted a resolution on Ulsapat Muradova, an activist who died in prison. It calls for certain measures to be taken, that resolution. What is being done? The Turkmen government is well aware also that a European court handed down a decision on Kajiev. What's the outcome? We're all waiting for the president to make a move, but he's doing nothing. The Turkmen Institute for Democracy and Human Rights was established in order to kickstart the application of such decisions, such judgments. We have the opportunity to set a precedent to right the wrongs of the regime. And for everyone in the room who's not well versed in these matters, in fact, the secret services, the prosecutor general, who had trumped up all of these charges, were themselves then charged. The ODIHR is a platform for dialogue between the government and activists and NGOs. So let's begin that dialogue. For many years, we've been coming here to engage in a dialogue with the official delegation. However, last year, representatives of the delegation acted not as diplomats, but as security guards out of some D-grade action movie. The dialogue won't take long. Let's do it. And in fact, Mr. Harlem Desir could assist us in this endeavor. So we call on you to make a step forward.
Press Council.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon, Mr. Desir, distinguished participants. A lot has been said today, and a lot more will be said about the freedom of expression in Ukraine. I'd like to focus on a very specific issue and put forward some recommendations. We call for immediate investigations into the doings of the website Miratvorets, Peacekeeper, and the people behind that website. Everyone knows that the site enjoys no official status. The domain name is registered in Thailand. However, personal data is published on that website. According to the people running the website, these people are traitors. They're either traitors or have committed crimes against national security. Now, the publications take place anonymously. No evidence is put forward. There are tens of thousands of these. There are names of Ukrainians, but also foreign journalists, politicians, religious leaders, anyone and everyone expressing views which the authorities and the security forces dislike. My name is also on that website. My data's up there. And in fact, we joke about this in Ukraine, that we're members of an elite club, that we've done so much for our country that our name has been added to the list. But jokes aside, the Ukrainian journalist, Alisa Buzina, was killed outside her own home after his address was added to the website. In fact, no one has been punished for that crime. At the same time, data provided by that website has been used by Ukrainian courts in handing out verdicts in over 100 cases. So courts can hand down a guilty verdict, they can prolong arrests without any investigations, without any trials being conducted, simply because someone running the website deemed these people to be criminals. We have been investigating the activities of this website in Ukraine, but we've achieved very little. We have reason to believe that data is being unlawfully transferred to this website from the law enforcement authorities' websites. We call on the OSCE to draw attention to the work of this website and everyone in the security services helping to run it. Thank you.
Followed by Finland.
Thank you, Andrei. I'm Azar Asret, representing Azerbaijan Press Council. I'm a Foreign Relations Commissioner within Press Council. Azerbaijan Press Council has launched a monitoring group to monitor the situation with journalists during mass actions, demonstrations. This group is consisted of the representatives of Press Council, Ministry of Justice, and Ministry of Internal Affairs, and it is very effective. While something happens to journalists, they can immediately report to Press Council or other group members, which immediately acts and solves the problem in the field. Then I would like to mention some moments while some representatives voiced accusations in regard to Azerbaijan. For example, the U.S. representatives named a person, Said Dadashvili. I'm surprised why the United States of America is defending a person which is the clerical leader who organized armed terrorist group and is serving prison sentence. So what's the interest of the United States to name this person here? And then on behalf of European Union was the statement saying someone just Anar Mammadov. Who is that? I don't know. We don't know a journalist named Anar Mammadov in prison. I would like to ask the EU representative or the person who named these journalists just to give more information. I'm a representative of Azerbaijan Press Council. We know every journalist, we know every case of in regard to journalists, so please give more information. Unfortunately, we have very limited time to voice to express ourselves here. Thank you.
Thank you. Finland, to be followed by Tajik Cultural Center of Samanyon in Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Finland fully aligns itself with the EU statement. However, I would like to highlight a few issues in my national capacity. I will first read out our recommendations. Finland calls on all participants, governments and civil society alike to actively promote provision of media and digital literacy training for youth, both through formal and informal education, in order to build resilience to disinformation and foster active citizenship and democracy. Finland calls on all participating states to support the work of the OSCE independent institutions and their strong and independent mandates. Freedom of expression, assembly and association are key building blocks of democracy. Every government has a duty to ensure a safe environment for journalists and the civil society. Pluralist media and investigating journalism are more important than ever in today's world, where disinformation spreads quickly and can be orchestrated to fragment society. However, the situation tends to be worse in context of more media control. Censored or controlled media is already by definition manipulation of information. Pluralist free media context in turn allows wider scale of viewpoints and, especially combined with the adequate media literacy, provides better resilience to disinformation. My Romanian colleague already reminded us about our common side event today. You are all warmly welcome. Media and digital literacy is the literacy of today. Media education in Finland has made headway in recent years. We will distribute our full statement. Now I would like to speak on behalf of the European Union. In reply to some of the remarks made this morning, the European Union reiterates its strong condemnation of the illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol to the Russian Federation, and we will not recognize it. We therefore regret the attempts by some participants of this meeting to use a legitimate opportunity for discussion and dialogue to make points related to a situation that is in contradiction with Helsinki principles. Thank you.
Thank you. Tajik Cultural Center of Samanyon in Kazakhstan, to be followed by Eurasian Dialect Institution.
Mr. Moderator, Mr. Representative, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Valib Atelyochem. I'm the Vice President of the Samanyon Association in Kazakhstan. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event. Such events are extremely important for us because each of us present has an opportunity to express views on various items on the agenda. I'm very proud to live in Kazakhstan. It is a country that successfully presided over the OSCE in 2010 after an 11-year break that occurred again, and in those 11 years no other country managed to do this. It's a very important achievement of Kazakhstan, and we, the residents of Kazakhstan, are very grateful to the authorities and the people of Kazakhstan for the opportunities made available to us as a Semyon in difficult times. In 1999, when we were in difficult straits, Kazakhstan held out its hands to us. We became refugees of a war in Tajikistan, and the great people of Kazakhstan welcomed us and they shared their last loaf of bread with us. But please speak to the subject. Now, the so-called Islamic Party in Kazakhstan is taking advantage of the media to foment hatred against the people of Tajikistan. Thank you very much for your statement.
Democrats. Eurasian Dialogue Institution.
Yes, I'm here. Добрый день, дамы и господа.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The number of Tajikistani media outlets who deliberately spread fake news is growing. The state agency Havar, Sputnik Tajikistan, Cumhuriyet, Minbari Halk, and just to name but a few. As part of their activities, the security services basically oversee the work of these media outlets. All fake news pursue political objectives. First of all, they attempt to undermine the authorities' reputation as well as the party in power. That's the first goal. And also the second. Slander, libel, and other attacks on representatives of civil society, as well as Tajikistani opposition members, inter alia, have been observed of late. The security services have fake accounts, fake news groups online, especially on Facebook. This adds to all of the threats facing journalists. The threat of being murdered and also the threat of being labeled. There are many fake accounts of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Security Services. There are over 160 such accounts. Most fake news are prepared by the security services in Tajikistan, and then all sorts of bogus names are used to disseminate them. The government also has other means that it uses to disseminate fake news, including via pro-government journalists and media outlets coordinate their activities closely with the security services. The dissemination of fake news has also targeted international conferences like our own, and we've witnessed that ourselves.
Democrats, to be followed by United Kingdom.
Thank you. I'm Yegena Hajeva from Azerbaijan. Our institute, we work into the protecting women's and child rights, promote gender equality and women activity in politics in my country. But here in my speech I would like to mention digital technologies, internet resource, and express their impact to local society. The internet resource turned into manipulation means to global science to change the values that are backbone to local society, and respectively to broadcast visually they clash on the social media that don't exist in reality. It is no doubt that the long-standing targets of propagandas made over the press and media threaten and destroy local social political stability in local countries. This propaganda over the press play means to destroy media and press policy governments and states. In the modern world, the operation and fake news flow that are carried as a soft power by social media outlets are manipulation platforms to shake social, political, and press security in the world. We don't need army to wage a war anymore to occupy territories now. Social media is an art to manipulate, to make propaganda and control in society, especially young, youth people views. We are extremely aware of this process in our country. Azerbaijan is a small country between Iran and Russia. As a country located on the partition of the strategic transit communication from east to west, from south to north, as a country in which 20% of territory is occupied by Armenia. Of course, as a modern Muslim world in the country, we extremely aware this process. Therefore, we should accept that correction of internet policy, sometimes like as a ban sites and suspicious social media accounts within systematically, spreading fake news, terrorism, extremism, and radicalism that are some restriction and according to human rights in terms to assure the security of states and local societies. Thank you.
United Kingdom, to be followed by CPJ.
Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. The United Kingdom fully aligns ourselves with the statements given by Sweden and just now by Finland on behalf of the EU and would like to add some comments in our national capacity. We have two principal recommendations for participating states. First, to consider joining the new Media Freedom Coalition by signing the Global Pledge, and second, to consider developing a national action plan that protects the safety of journalists. The United Kingdom has long been committed to media freedom and to promoting it globally, including the safety of journalists, as part of how we champion human rights across the world. In 2018, together with Canada, we launched a global campaign for media freedom with the aim of increasing the global spotlight on media freedom and in raising the cost to those who restrict or who abuse journalists for doing their jobs. Our global conference for media freedom, as mentioned by Canada, who co-hosted it with us in July, brought together over 60 ministers and 1,500 delegates from 100 countries. And we were delighted that many across the OSCE region attended, and indeed pleased that you, Mr. Desir, and your team from the Office of the Representative of the Freedom of Media joined us there and launched together with the Organization of American States, the UN, African Union and civil society, your joint declaration on freedom of expression. In response to your and the OSCE's appeal for member states to develop national committees and action plans on the safety of journalists, the United Kingdom is now in the process of developing its own committee and action plan. And through the global campaign, we are encouraging all governments to develop national action plans. We're delighted that the OSCE is joining with UNESCO to spearhead the international task force that will support member states to do this and apply best practice. We can send a strong signal that we have a shared goal and are committed to promoting media freedom and the fight against impunity. And as I mentioned, we encourage you to consider joining the Media Freedom Coalition, which will be launched in New York at the UN General Assembly next week by signing the Global Pledge and contributing to the new Global Media Defence Fund. Together we can make a difference if we focus on practical actions. And we look forward to discussing this further tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, United Kingdom. Committee to Protect Journalists, to be followed by Italy.
On the 16th of October, it will be 2 years since Maltese anti-corruption journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia was brutally assassinated. The Committee to Protect Journalists continues to remain gravely concerned that judicial proceedings have not resulted in either the perpetrators or the masterminds of the killing being brought to justice. We and press freedom groups have also called on the Maltese authorities to immediately establish an independent public inquiry into whether the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia could have been prevented. In a meeting on the 15th of October 2017, Prime Minister Muscat repeatedly told an international press freedom delegation that it was not a matter of whether, but when, a public inquiry would be established. Well, so far it has almost been a year. At the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in June, the Maltese authorities were given a 3-month deadline until the 26th of September to establish an independent and effective public inquiry. We today call on the Maltese authorities to see through this independent public inquiry. We need to have an assessment of the circumstances that led to the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, and to ask whether or not the state could have prevented it. Critical journalists on the ground, including those covering corruption, need to be protected. The family needs justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Italy, to be followed by International Platform's Global Rights of Peaceful People.
Grazie. Thank you, Moderator. Italy fully supports the statement made by Sweden on behalf of the European Union, but we'd like to share the experience of our country. In 2007, the Italian government set up the Center of Coordination to Combat Intimidation of Journalists. This center is the first initiative of this kind at the European level, and it is run by the Ministry of Home Affairs and journalists, the former immediately intervening when there are episodes of intimidation and provides the necessary support. The Ministry of Home Affairs informs appropriate forces of law and order and prosecutors if there are events occurring at the local level that amount to attacks on or intimidation of local journalists. And the Italian police force has carried out investigations in more than 150 such cases. The objective being to defend the freedom of the press and to make sure that it can fully exercise its duties. Thank you.
Thank you. International program Global Rights of Peaceful People to be followed by the Czech Republic.
Mr. Moderator, distinguished experts. In Ukraine, there are some opposition news outlets such as News One or Kanal Yazyk, but in fact they're only allegedly opposition media outlets. Allegedly, because over the last 5 years they've been swimming against the current. They've expressed alternative views. The Poroshenko regime tried to crack down on them. They sent right-wing activists to their offices. They beat up the journalists and trashed their offices. At the start of September, News One, Zik, the 112 channel, well, a decision was taken to simply shut them down. And in fact, one politician said that anti-tank missiles should be used to blow up these media outlets. So these are not outlets which were spreading hate, inciting violence. No, they were simply outlets which had alternative views on what was going on in Ukraine. On the 16th of September, News One journalists appealed to the international community for their support for the freedom of expression in Ukraine. Journalists from this channel and others have sent these appeals to the embassies of many countries, including Italy, for instance, yesterday. The channel's correspondent, Mr. Bogdan Aminov, told us this. Recently, a prisoner exchange took place between Russia and Ukraine. Russia handed over sailors captured in the Kerch Strait, and Oleg Sentsov was also handed back. 35 prisoners were exchanged on both sides. However, the constitution was, in fact, violated, the constitution of Ukraine. There it states clearly that an Ukrainian citizen cannot be expelled outside Ukraine or handed over to a foreign state. We call on the OSCE to draw attention to the situation in Ukraine and to ensure the upholding of the constitution and fundamental rights and liberties.
Russian Baltic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Czech Republic aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. However, I'd like to add a few comments in my national capacity. We share the concern expressed repeatedly by the EU and other partners over the worsening situation with regard to freedom of expression and opinion in several OSCE participating states. We do believe that persecution and restrictions on civil society actors and independent media, as well as intimidation and attacks on journalists, should be properly investigated by the state authorities, which is not always the case. And we therefore call on the participating states to ensure a safe and enabling environment for independent media. We'd like to thank the representative on freedom of the media, Mr. Harlem Desir, and his team for excellent job and for invitation to all OSCE member states to engage constructively with the Office of Representative for Freedom of the Media and to implement its recommendations. Continuous and significant support to independent media constitute an integral part of the Czech foreign policy, and the importance of this support has only grown over the last couple of years as we have been facing numerous disinformation campaigns across the OSCE region. Therefore, in 2019, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has increased funding allocated specially to support independent media that are committed to impartial and unbiased reporting and investigation. And we are also concerned by those legal initiatives threatening to restrict free media and freedom of expression by misusing the terrorism legislation or citing security concerns for this purpose. It is, of course, the responsibility of all governments to ensure the safety of their citizens, but in today's worsening climate, the security of journalists is particularly endangered. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Center of Social Political Sciences, Russian Baltic, to be followed by Baltic Media Research Center.
Добрый день.
Good morning, Chairman, dear colleagues. Thank you. At the present time, unfortunately, the Baltic republics are incubators of democratic practices or even anti-democratic practices that are being exported to other countries. The Euro integration of the Baltic republics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, was supposedly an export of European values. But after they joined the European Union, it turned out that their standards are very far from the democratic principles of the European Union. Most of the cases of limitation of freedom of expression in the Baltic republics are designed to change the historical views. In Lithuania, for instance, Galin Sapochnikov, a Russian journalist, was charged with the publication of a book, which in fact really just sets out certain factual events of 1991. There is a nationalist basis after the Second World War of certain conflicts that took place. There has been the transformation of certain bandit groups that raged in those countries into heroes. And people who have criticized this have seen their books banned, taken away from bookstores, and Landsberg has called, in fact, for people to be hung in the forests for what they have done this. And the journalists and other public individuals who have taken views on historical subjects that are inconvenient for the authorities have in fact been banned from entering the country. In 2014, an Italian journalist was banned from entering Estonia. And there are lists of individuals who are supposedly disloyal to the state. I'm sorry, but your time is over.
By Union of Women of Russia.
Уважаемый господин Дезир.
Mr. Harlem Desir, distinguished colleagues, I'll get the ball rolling by listing some recommendations. First of all, I want to thank our hosts for organizing this event. I call on all OSCE participating states to cast aside all pretexts which are sometimes used to restrict the freedom of expression and the freedom of the press. Government ideologies are also sometimes used, political ends are pursued, and this is why restrictions are imposed on the media and on the freedom of expression. These restrictions are often are now common currency in many participating states, including the EU, despite the fact that in the various rankings of democratic states, they rank quite highly, and human rights are said to be respected there. I represent Baltic countries where people are frequently persecuted because of their political opinions. What we've seen is that the governments of the countries are simply
countries where people were being abused. That's not. This is supposed to be an independent NGO. We've seen a farce on this in this meeting, and now we're seeing somebody stand up and say he represents countries. That's inappropriate. It's a point of order, and he's out of order.
Point of order is taken. Вам понятен point of...
Do you understand the point of order? No, I don't understand. I don't represent a country. I'm talking about countries. I'm talking about specific instances of incidents that have occurred in certain countries. So I'm not sure what the issue is with my statement. I assume that you are attempting to prevent me from continuing my statement from expressing my point of view. So if I may, I'm going to continue. In the Baltic states, because of ideology and historical policy, sometimes violence is used in prisons and dissenters see their rights violated. For instance, Mr. Sapalitskis, a political activist and journalist. Twice he was charged because of his purported ideology. He's now behind bars. He was charged with being a traitor. I also want to draw your attention to the persecution of Russian officers in Lithuania. Thank you very much. Your time is up.
By Azerbaijan.
Ladies and gentlemen, I represent an NGO called the Union of Women of Russia. It's the largest organization bringing together women. We have regional branches in all regions. I came from the Samurskaya Oblast, from the Far East, and I would like to welcome all journalists present here and to invite them to come and visit us. Don't just listen to rumors about the Russian Federation. Come and talk to people, talk to women, talk to our civil society organizations, and develop your own opinion. We've been asked to start with recommendations, so let me do that. In future meetings of the OSCE, I would like to see more attention paid to the following proposals. Positive journalism. This is the opinion of women. At the present time, our future cannot be developed without the transmission of a positive model of the role of women and of socioeconomic development as a whole. We would like to see human rights strengthened. At the present time, a lot of journalists don't take full responsibility for what they write. And we also would like to see on the agenda of the OSCE and at such meetings that there be more time for a genuine exchange. We would certainly be prepared to answer any questions you may have, and we invite you to visit us in the Far East.
By Turkmen independent journalist.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. As I emphasized yesterday, Azerbaijan state takes consistent steps to further develop the freedom of speech and information, as well as to ensure the safety of journalists, transparency and responsible media approach, and intends to continue its efforts in the future and is ready for open dialogue on these issues with all international structures and local organizations. The authorities regularly express their attitude to issues raised on social networks, treat the internet as one of the resources of the information and use it. From observation and analysis, it becomes clear that in recent years, social networks have been trying to expand the possibilities and influencing public opinion. But here is necessary to note that along with the trends that positively characterize the role of social networks, negative trends also appear. On the one hand, social networks open up new perspectives in ensuring freedom of expression and opinion. On the other hand, sometimes the mutual influence between social networks and human rights creates undesirable situations. Thus, there are cases of humiliation of honor and dignity of people in social networks, and this means violation of human rights. Unfortunately, such negative cases are sometimes found in the activities of transnational media as well. The positive point associated with broadcasting transnational media structures in the country is that the population has the opportunity to receive up-to-date information about the processes taking place in the world. The negative point is that sometimes under the influences of various political circles or lobby groups, transnational media structures are trying to manipulate public opinion, disseminate biased, subjective information in contradiction to principles such as objectivity and impartiality. Summarizing the above mentioned, it can be concluded that the Azerbaijan government considers ensuring freedom of speech and press, the development of mass media outlets as one of the main directions of the state. And I will use my right of reply. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Speaking of the right of reply, there are 7 countries which wanted to exercise their right of reply. There is still possibility to put the country's name in the list. Turkmen independent journalist to be followed by Open Dialogue Foundation. Microphone.
Microphone, please. Ladies and gentlemen, I have come from a country which has been called a dictatorship by international organizations. I'm Ms. Maliyev from Turkmenistan. Unless I'm mistaken, 4 months ago, Reporters Without Borders stated that the media situation in Turkmenistan is worse than in North Korea. I agree that not all is rosy, but I disagree that we're at the very bottom of the list. I know that international organizations have done a great deal of work, and therefore I want to state that unfortunately we have hardly any media freedom in Turkmenistan. We have many problems. Nonetheless, the situation is not that bad. Not as bad as some internet sites have reported, using unsubstantiated materials as evidence. Very often, all of their reporting is based on lies and hearsay. In late July, some websites spread rumors about the death of the head of my country. I want to draw your attention to the fact that you might have all heard about a student from Turkmenistan. And, in fact, this student was charged and convicted to 20 years in prison. And, in fact, we heard that his father had died when he heard what happened. In fact, we saw his... I do apologize, your time is up. I must continue. And the people who spread these rumors, unfortunately, were not from Turkmenistan. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Followed by Independent Center for Human Rights Protection.
Thank you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, all-encompassing propaganda is one of the largest problems of media environment and public life in Kazakhstan. Virtually all media outlets are dependent on the authorities, and that is why they portray their representatives in an extremely positive light. Sadly, the reality is completely opposite to that picture. Kazakh government is trying to control all the information space, even the internet, which they block almost on a daily basis. On 9 June 2019, on the day of presidential election, internet providers totally cut the internet access for most users in the country. Within a few days, at least 4,000 unguilty peaceful protesters were detained. At least 12 of them were journalists who were covering protests. Propaganda in Kazakhstan is powerful and affects also international fora. Yesterday, some of you could see how the Kazakhstani delegation reacted to a set of basic facts and numbers related to the political prosecution in the country. I would like to remind that Human Dimension Implementation Meeting is a place where NGOs present their findings and observations. Yesterday, after doing exactly this, I was attacked by the Kazakhstani propaganda myself. Instead of referring to the merits of my speech, I was insulted alongside the Open Dialogue Foundation as allegedly paid by the Kazakh businessman and exiled oppositionist. That's obviously false. My organization issued several statements on this topic. Our president, Mrs. Kozlovska, has a resident permit in Belgium and she was removed from the SIS by Poland in June 2019. I dare to speak about the situation of the Kazakh civil society as we have received over 2,000 requests for help from persecuted Kazakh citizens.
Thank you.
Our report...
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Independent Center for Human Rights Protection to be followed by National Union of Journalists of Ukraine. Independent Center for Human Rights Protection, is it here? No, then please, National Union of Journalists of Ukraine.
Dear colleagues, in the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, we support the proposals of the representative of media of the freedom of the OSCE that the main threats to freedom of expression are intimidation, attacks on journalists, and our union works for the safety of journalists, their ability to work on the territory controlled by the Ukrainian authorities, on the territory of the Russian Federation, and also on the annexed territory and in Donbass. We criticize the fact that there is full impunity for attacks against journalists. There is a lack of serious investigations, and when someone even is found guilty, the sanction is risible. And Admiral Komarov in the city of Cherkas was attacked this way, and there was no real investigation. We believe there should be a strong political will to investigate all attacks against journalists, especially when committed by radicals. Unfortunately, this is something that often happens. There is harassment and intimidation by radicals. Ugrinform, in July of this year, for instance, had its office attacked. The radicals who did this were not even charged by the police. There was no real investigation. We produce regular reports on this, and we believe that there should be full investigations and full reporting on intimidation of journalists. Roman Sushchenko has been freed from a Russian prison. We believe that that is a very positive thing, but he should not have been there in the first place. There are Crimean Tatar journalists who are in jail in Crimea. Semenov, for instance, has been fully prevented from exercising his profession. When it comes to Donbass, we express our solidarity with our colleague Sermeyev, who has been in prison for 2 years, and he will be turning 30 soon, and we would like every effort to be made to free him.
UA.
Thank you. I would like to thank Mr. Alim Gazir for his overview on the current state of media in OSCE region and profound insight into the challenges which journalists and media workers face while carrying out their professional functions. Freedom of expression constitutes an important pillar of promotion of human rights in Armenia. Today, the press enjoys an unprecedented high level of freedom in the country. The commitment of the government to refrain from controlling the media outlets is essential in creating a conducive framework for media independence and pluralism. The progress made after the Velvet Revolution in Armenia in protecting the freedom of expression and the press has been highly appreciated by our international partners, including Mr. Desir, who stated that freedom of expression is very developed in Armenia and should remain protected. According to the 2019 World Press Freedom Index by Reporters Without Borders, Armenia has improved its press freedom score by 19 points and moved up to the 61st place out of 180 countries in the world. Armenia has also been positioned as a free country in the annual Freedom on the Net 2018 report by Freedom House after citizens had successfully used social media platforms, communication apps, and live streaming services to engender political change in the country in April last year. At the same time, it should be noted that the use of fake social media accounts and attempts to spread various disinformation have dramatically increased both locally and globally. The problem of fake news is under close attention of the Armenian government, which is facing the challenge of fighting against the dangerous phenomenon without adverse effect for the freedom of expression. We consider implementation of specific targeted programs to raise media literacy, particularly amongst youth, as an essential tool in effective fight against misinformation. In this context, we stress the importance of providing the local media with various mechanisms of assistance from international organizations and expanding the scope of programs in this sphere in order to ensure free flow of information for all, transparency and accountability of the government. We reiterate our readiness to continue the close cooperation with the Office of the Representative on the Freedom of the Media to further promote the freedom of expression and media in the country. I thank you.
Thank you. Online newspaper Strana UA, to be followed by Coordination Center for Freedom of Expression.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon. My name is Igor Evzhina. I am the editor of Strana UA, that newspaper. Last year, I was forced to leave the Ukraine following attacks by right-wing organizations and criminal charges levied against me. These were charges leveled by the Poroshenko regime. The authorities did not hide the fact that they wanted to put me behind bars, and the right-wing assailants said that they were going to do the same to me as they did to Alexei Buzina. He is that journalist who was killed several years ago, and in fact, the perpetrators have not yet been brought to justice. As a result of these threats, I was forced to leave the Ukraine and seek refuge in Austria. Exactly 1 year ago, I was granted asylum because it was deemed that there was a politically motivated criminal case against me and also threats. We, Ukrainian journalists, had hoped that politically motivated criminal cases targeting me, Mr. Vasiltsov, next to me, and other journalists, we hoped that those would come to an end. We also hoped that there'd be a crackdown on right-wing organizations targeting media organizations such as the Mirotvorets, the peacekeeping website, which another colleague mentioned. However, we've seen very little change. In fact, the authorities are now attacking News One and 112, opposition news channel. Licensing has become more difficult. Also, we've seen some politicians calling for the Minsk agreements to be implemented and into the war in Donbass, and those reports have been censored. Thus, the state is censoring the media. We call international organizations to draw attention to the freedom of expression in Ukraine, which has not improved despite the fact that there's been a change of government.
Center for Freedom of Expression, to be followed by public organization Crimea SOS.
Good morning, and thank you very much to the organizers for making it possible for me to provide some real information about the situation of freedom of expression in Ukraine. I would like to draw the attention of a number of European countries to the fact that the rights of journalists and freedom of speech are being violated not only in Turkey and in Russia. There are many such cases also in Ukraine. Let me give you some concrete examples. For his activities to disseminate information, Miktin Moshur, who's 85, has been in prison for a number of years already. Now, you can imagine that a journalist who's 85, and he's been in prison for more than 2 years without real charges. And this is not an isolated example. There are many such examples. So we would call on European countries to provide some more careful attention to the situation of freedom of speech and media freedom in Ukraine, not just in Turkey and Russian Federation. Then there's Mursaliyev, another journalist who was a year in prison, and now he's under house arrest. That means that for 18 months he's not been able to leave his own home. He'd be arrested right away and put back in prison. Insofar as a violation of the rights of journalists are concerned, there are a number of situations concerning the situation of journalists trying to work in embassies. And the civil servants of ministries of foreign affairs would not like journalists to be on the territory of embassies to control and to verify how voting is organized, which opens the suspicion that there could be violations of voting rights on embassy territory.
For human rights protection.
Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Tamila Tasheva. I'm the coordinator of Crimea SOS. When we heard statements from our so-called colleagues from the territory of the occupied peninsula, my organization was deemed to be an extremist organization. Here at plenary, we heard representatives of the occupying power practically directly threatened advocates, lawyers defending human rights who'd come here to tell you about what's happening in Crimea, the criminal cases against journalists such as Reza Asanov and Mr. Mustafayev. In fact, they were charged with accepting money for their reporting. Therefore, we believe that this august assembly should help combat this pressure that's been exerted on lawyers, on independent citizen journalists. We call on the OSCE to monitor this issue very closely, because all of the people who come here from the territory of the occupied peninsula, the ones who protect citizen journalists, who are spreading the word about the freedom of the media, the freedom of expression on the peninsula, they will have to be back in the Crimea very soon. And we fear that they will encounter problems at the border between the peninsula, the occupied peninsula, and mainland Ukraine. We fear that their offices will be searched yet again. We saw this already. Mr. Emil Kurbedinov, a lawyer from the Crimea, already had his offices searched. We're very concerned about this, so please do monitor the situation, follow up on how they're doing, so as to ensure that they can come back and that they're not persecuted in any way. Furthermore, I wanted to draw your attention yet again to the fact that the freedom of expression doesn't mean a free-for-all. We want to strike a balance between different opinions. Therefore, I call on so-called Crimean journalists who took the rostrum here today, who took the floor. I call on them to remember that it's very important to strike a balance between different opinions. Therefore, when we listen to various Crimean media outlets, read their reporting, and we hear that Crimean terrorists are plotting some kind of terrorist attacks, when we hear, please wrap up, says the moderator. When we hear that a fascist junta is working in Ukraine, well, that's not what's actually happening. Therefore, we hear lots of organizations spreading information, not about the freedom of the media, but information about how the Ukrainian government is persecuting Ukrainian journalists. Thank you very much.
We move to the right of reply. I have 11 countries which want to exercise it.
Are they here?
I'm sorry. Independent Center for Human Rights Protection. Did you speak or not? Independent Center for Human Rights Protection. I think they spoke. So the right of reply, the first right of reply goes to France, to be followed by Kazakhstan, and I limit the right of reply to 1 minute, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. No, but the Independent Center was not able to speak yet. I'm sorry. Yes, we're sitting here. Yes, you may go ahead, please. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to the organizers for making it possible for us to take the floor at this event. In Article 19 of the International Pact on Civil and Political Rights, the standards for freedom of expression and freedom of opinion are set up. That needs to be respected in any democratic society. Every individual has the right to hold and express his own opinion. In paragraph 2 of that article, there is a particular obligation set out when it comes to respecting this right. Nevertheless, it can be accompanied with some restrictions, but they must be set out in law. In the national legislation of the Republic of Tajikistan, in Part 1 of Article 30 of the Constitution, it is stated that every individual has the right to freedom of expression and access to means of information. However, when it comes to access by physical and legal persons to information, a number of restrictions are introduced because there is no general instruction provided to all state entities when it comes to responding to requests for information. Now, there is a report about transparency and accountability of governmental structures in Tajikistan, and there are various times set out when it comes to responses to requests for information. For instance, a state entity must respond to a request for information within 30 days, but 15 days is the limit if additional study is not required for the information to be provided. Now, there is a right to extend the period beyond 30 days, provided that is justified. So there is a guaranteed right of access to information, provided that information is freely available, but the time limit can be extended. Thank you very much, but your time limit is up, and of course you will be able to provide that report in writing. Unfortunately, your speaking time is over.
Return to right of reply, France to be followed by Kazakhstan.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to access the right of reply of France in response to what was said by the Russian Federation. We reject any accusation of pressure or discrimination against Russian media in our country. RT France and Sputnik have been investigated by our authorities since the presidential elections of 2017 because of certain dubious activities, but they continue to work in France. There can be no putting into doubt of freedom of the media in our country. There is no automatic right to participate in any press event. A press conference of the French president is an event to which journalists are invited, either individually or on the basis of their accreditation. A number of disinformation events vehiculated by the Russian journalists concerning the yellow vests in France. There isn't a freedom to disinform. There is a freedom of media. And we would also like, at the same time, to support the right of reply that will be expressed by Finland on behalf of the EU subsequently.
Thank you. Kazakhstan to be followed by Tajikistan.
Thank you, Andrei. I want to reply to Radio Liberty. There are several reasons for the mishappening. One of them is that every 3 years, law enforcement officers have to be attested. 3 years ago, they were attested, and only 25,000 out of 86,000 were found matching their professional duties. The rest were not matching, and many of them even were ignoramus about their basic duties. That is one reason. Another reason that the law enforcement agencies are among the agencies which have the highest level of corruption in Kazakhstan. And the third reason, the detainees, most of the detainees were not journalists, and journalists which were detained, they didn't have their ID numbers. They didn't represent themselves as the journalists. Thank you.
Спасибо. Tajikistan to be followed by the USA.
Thank you very much. I should like to exercise my right of reply regarding access to information and how long it takes to get that information. In line with our legislation, the authorities in the Republic of Tajikistan must respond to media requests in 3 days. Also, the authorities must organize major press conferences at least twice a year, and at those press conferences, they are to report back on their activities over the last 6 months and also answer all questions put to them by journalists. According to International Press Agency, and in fact, this is something I mentioned in my earlier statement, our national legislation stipulates that propaganda and the dissemination of extremist or terrorist organizations' views is against the law. A number of international press agencies have served as platforms for these organizations to spread their views, and these are organizations which have been recognized as being extremist or terrorist or extremist by our courts, such as the Islamic Renaissance Party and others. Also, there are pseudo-bogus NGOs here trying to disseminate their views, allegedly representing civil society, which is just not true. Thank you very much.
Russia.
I wish to exercise my right of reply in response to the interventions of numerous civil society organizations which veered away from the subject of the session, fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of expression, and instead included overtly political and provocative points. As such, I must respond. Crimea is not a part of the Russian Federation, but rather an integral part of Ukraine, a fact recognized by all OSCE participating states. The United States does not and never will recognize Russia's purported annexation of Crimea, and our associated sanctions will remain in force until Moscow returns control of the peninsula to Ukraine.
Thank you. Russian Federation, to be followed by Malta.
I don't think my microphone is working. Could we have the other one switched off? Thank you. Now it's working. Insofar as the detention of journalists during the unsanctioned actions in August in Moscow. Well, if a journalist behaves in a way that goes beyond his status, and then the privileges are lost. Now, in this connection, journalists were detained under the ordinary laws concerning verification of documentation, and then they were released. Now, some Western mass media have tried to influence the electoral campaigns in the Russian Federation, and that's not acceptable. And at the same time, I would like to note that the city of Sevastopol and the territory of Crimea are a part and parcel of the Russian Federation, and we find it unacceptable to try to use the tribune of the OSCE to attack the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation.
To exercise the right of reply, because the sad case of Daphne Caruana Galizia was raised, a case that my delegation intended to raise tomorrow when the safety of journalists will be discussed. A number of points. First of all, the killing was immediately condemned by the highest authorities of Malta. 50 days after the heinous killing, 3 persons were arrested, and in July of this year, the same 3 persons were indicted and formally accused of the murder. The investigations continued. Then the issue of the independent public inquiry was raised. And I wish to inform that my government is actively engaged with international organizations, mainly with the Council of Europe, to find a way to hold the inquiry in a manner which will not, however, prejudice or conflict with the current criminal proceedings against these 3 individuals. Malta has never stood against the inquiry. The only challenge that we have at hand at the moment is the sequencing of how the inquiry will take place together with the criminal proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you. Georgia, to be followed by Azerbaijan.
Thank you. Georgia wants to use the right of reply to express its regret that some participants are using this important forum, not for discussions on pressing topics of the agenda, but for the promotion of their so-called political statuses that are the results of Russia's illegal actions, such as occupations and annexations of the regions of sovereign states, sovereign countries, participating states of the OSCE. Georgia reiterates its strong condemnation of the illegal annexation of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by Russian Federation, and will not recognize it. Thank you.
Thank you. Azerbaijan, to be followed by Armenia.
Thank you very much. I see that neither delegation of EU nor delegation of Sweden doesn't know anything about Anar Mammadov and about the realities concerning his arrest. Anar Mammadov is the editor of Criminal As website, who was distributing false and hatred information regarding an attack against the mayor of country's second largest city, Ganja. That's why Baku court for serious crime found the editors guilty abuse of professional duties and forgery. I would like to also exercise my right of reply to delegation of USA. Actually, I didn't hear any religious figure's name in my colleagues' list that listed. Azerbaijan is the country where Christian and Muslims and other religions living together for centuries. If one religion person or one uses religion as a tool to act in a terroristic manner, he has to, for him, for her, for him, has to be taken strict measures by law enforcement bodies.
Thank you.
Like in each participating state. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Armenia and then Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I will be extremely brief. Representative of the civil society, while commenting on the freedom of expression in Azerbaijan, took an attempt to give distorted interpretation of the past events. I'd like to remind that what was qualified as an occupation of 20% of the territory of Azerbaijan was in fact the right to self-determination of people of Nagorno-Karabakh in line with all international norms. Thank you.
I have a point of order.
Point of order.
Thank you very much. I think that Armenian delegation should know, Armenian delegation knows, and every participating state doesn't recognize any republic, so-called republic, and also Armenia illegally occupied Azerbaijani 20% and 7 adjacent regions of Azerbaijan, and still.
This is not point of order.
Yes.
Ma'am, this is not point of order.
Say thank you.
Thank you. Canada to be followed by Finland.
Moderator, I am exercising this right of reply with regard to the interventions made today by the Russian Federation. I wish to underscore that the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol are an integral part of Ukraine, and Canada does not and will not recognize the attempted illegal annexation of the peninsula by the Russian Federation, nor the latter's other attacks on the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. With regard to media freedom in this part of Ukraine, we would point to the recent UN Secretary General's report entitled, quote, Situation of Human Rights in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea of Sevastopol, Ukraine, which indicates receiving, quote, credible and consistent accounts from journalists from Crimea who complained about interference from law enforcement authorities of the Russian Federation in their journalistic activities. The report further notes that, quote, Ukrainian journalists, as well as public figures who are perceived as critics of Crimea's occupation, have faced entry bans issued by Russia's Federal Security Service, or the FSB, and were unable to access Crimea to conduct their professional activities. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. Finland to be followed by Turkmenistan.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I pass the floor to the Ambassador of the European Union.
Thank you. In reply to some remarks that have been made during this session, we would like to reiterate our well-known position on the illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol by Russia. We do not, and will not recognize it. We regret the attempts by some participants of this meeting to use a legitimate opportunity for discussion and dialogue to make points relating to a situation that is in contradiction with Helsinki principles. We regret the attempts to whitewash the human rights situation in Crimea. They have not succeeded. We remain deeply concerned about the dire situation of human rights and the systematic restrictions of fundamental freedoms, including freedom of expression, faced by the residents of Crimea and Sevastopol since its illegal annexation by Russia. In reply to the question addressed to us on the definition of journalism, I want to state that journalism is a function shared by a wide range of actors. We believe that protection of journalists should not be limited to those formally recognized as journalists, but should cover others, including community, media workers, and citizen journalists, and others who may be using new media as a means of reaching their audiences, as stated in the UN Action Plan on the Safety of Journalists and the Issue of Impunity. Regarding Amar Mamadov, editor of an online platform, we would like to refer to the RFOM statement of 22 February for more details. We join the representative in his calls towards the authorities of Azerbaijan. Thank you.
Thank you. Turkmenistan and then Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As my country was mentioned by an NGO representative, I wanted to make the following statement. Regarding the travel bans imposed on Sultan Al-Chilava, the information we were given is false. The fact that she was not allowed to leave the country is not, in fact, a restriction. What happened was she was going on a trip as a tourist, and when she was leaving the country, she wasn't able to provide all of the required documents. These measures are only imposed in order to prevent citizens of our country from being trafficked. We're talking about human trafficking. She was informed that her rights were not being restricted, and she could travel within and outside the country. As for Consul Muradov's case, on numerous occasions, we have provided exhaustive, detailed information to various UN committees. Also, within the framework of our bilateral dialogue with the OSCE and EU, information about this case. So I don't think it's worth our time discussing the issue any further here. As for the travel ban allegedly imposed on the speaker's family, in my country, our citizens can leave the country unless in line with legislation. So regarding the information provided by the speaker in her statement, all of the allegations made do not speak to the main topic of our session here today. Thank you very much.
Followed by Switzerland.
I would like to use my right of reply regarding the issues raised by two speakers on the so-called political prosecution in Lithuania, which have little to do with it. Actually, these were the examples of a spread of disinformation and denial of crimes committed against Lithuania and its citizens. Publishing of books were forbidden in Lithuania due to the fact that in these books, authors were denying Soviet regime's crimes against humanity committed in Lithuania during and after World War II and on 13 January 1991. We would like to stress that in Lithuania, any person who disagrees with a decision of a respective state authority can realize the right to appeal against it. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last is Switzerland.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. In reply to some remarks during this session, we would like to reiterate our position, which remains unwavering. Switzerland condemns the annexation of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol as a breach of international law. Switzerland does not recognize this illegal annexation and reiterates its firm support for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Switzerland welcomed in the PC the 26th report on the situation of human rights in Ukraine by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The regular reporting is fundamental to human rights protection in Ukraine. We also urge the Russian Federation to grant international monitors, including OSCE, unhindered and unconditioned access to occupied Crimea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, like yesterday, I apologize to interpreters. One last intervention by the representative on freedom of the media to conclude the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you to the interpreter. So 4 short remarks. First, I want to thank all of you for your many interventions, participating states, civil society organizations. We took notes of all the mentioned situations. And we can see, of course, from the debate that there is not always a unanimous view on the different cases which were raised. But we will try to bring support or to continue to bring support, because for many of the individual cases which were mentioned, it was also recalls that we already intervened. We do it on the basis of the OSCE commitment. I would just say that, of course, I understand the logic, which is that when a situation happens in a specific participating state, the states answer to justify and say that the problem is not as it was presented, for example, by another state or by an NGO. But I would just suggest a little addition to this logic, which is absolutely classical and normal, is also to look at the way to help us to solve the situation. I recall yesterday that, and I was relieved by this, in the past days and weeks, we have seen the release of different journalists who were condemned, detained, and since many months and years, we hear that it was impossible to release them, to have pardons or to have a cancellation of the condemnation. At the end, it was okay. So I think everyone can also look at situations which are raised here during the HDIM and, of course, justify what was done, but also try to think of how it could be solved. Second remarks, many thanks to all those who expressed support to our mandate, to the autonomy of the institution, to the work of my team. It's not only that we appreciate it, but we need it. And I wanted to thank you for that. Three, this debate is not closed. It will be continued tomorrow morning in session 4 on safety, physical safety of journalists, and tomorrow afternoon in session 5 on legal safety, and also during several side events, including one just in a few minutes. And then to conclude, and that's my fourth remarks, I would say that, of course, again, it's absolutely normal that some interventions are here to explain how good is the situation in its own country, and sometimes it's true, and it's worth it, but I will just suggest to add also something more in interventions, which is how we can improve it, even when it's good, or when we think it's better than the reproach of the other. So this could be something for session 4 and session 5 on safety of journalists. What kind of good practices, what kind of new policies to implement the MC decision, how we can contribute to a constructive exchanges of ideas so that there will be even more protection of safety of journalists, of a good legal environment, of an enabling environment for the respect of the commitments of the OSCE on media freedom. On this, thank you very much, and I wish you a good lunch and good side events.
Thank you, Mr. Desir. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. There are side events now and well-deserved refreshments.